Good morning. Thank you for that. This morning you heard Tracy emphasize the importance of having the right data detailed to the necessary level of granularity. And then Donna came up here and she brought you up to speed on the latest results and trends and insights. Now we're going to delve deeper. Last year was the first time we unveiled industry-specific trends. And a big thank you to all of you, because apparently I'm back with this topic by popular demand. Today we'll first provide an update on the industries we discussed last year, and then we're going to drill into 4 new industries that are shown here. We'll explore how frequency trends have shifted and uncover key insights. And these insights by industry may help us better predict future trends. Also, we're going to give you a preview of an upcoming trend by industry report that will be published on ncci.com. Let's take a step back and examine the big picture across all industries. Take a look here at the average payroll distribution. Notice that office work dominates by far. But if we resort the industries on premium, the picture looks different. Combined office drops to 3rd place, while construction jumps to the top. And that's because a high-risk industry like construction is going to have higher loss costs. And just to make that real for you, consider that a hazardous job like roofers can be over 100 times that of clerical workers. And just for some background, we use the North American Industry Classification System, or NAICS, to help define the industries as you see them here. Now, as you heard from Donna, frequency has been in a decades-long decline, and that's good news about safer workplaces and fewer injured workers. But what's really interesting is that if we go to an industry-specific level, trends can be very different. Each of these lines represents one industry. So what's driving the variation that you see? Economic shifts, technology, other disruptions? While every industry does have its own unique story, notice there is a general pattern that emerges. Pre-pandemic, the frequency was negative for most industries. Then we see a pandemic-related drop in 2020, some amount of recovery in 2021, then we're back to where we started with a mostly declining post-pandemic trend. Let's look at this a different way. Here we see the pre-pandemic average annual change in frequency. And notice for the most part, trends are declining, although education is up slightly, and we're going to talk about that later. On the second chart, you could see that all industries experienced a 2020 pandemic decline, but notice there's substantial variation in the decrease. During the pandemic recovery period, once again, patterns are very different across industries. While construction experienced a minimal decrease, others had varying degrees of rebound. Take a look at combined office. It had a 10% drop during the pandemic in 2020, and then in 2021, frequency rose just 7%, so not quite back to pre-pandemic levels. On the other hand, look at leisure and hospitality. It fell considerably and then jumped right back to where it started. Compare the post-pandemic trends on the last chart to the pre-pandemic trends on the first chart. And notice they're very similar, but a bit more negative for most industries. So what are we seeing here? There are patterns during the different time periods, but the extent of the up and down is very different by industry. Now we're going to investigate each specific industry, and we're going to focus to a greater extent on the post-pandemic period because more recent years may be more predictive of future results. Okay, so the first industry that we'll provide an update on is construction. And if you remember from last year, we learned that frequency declined faster than any other industry, largely driven by a reduction in strain injuries. Also notice here that the pandemic impact on frequency was minimal. We don't see that big dip in 2020 like you do for many of the other industries. And today we have an additional data point, and we see that frequency continued to decline. It's slips and falls and strains that are having the biggest impact, although frequency for all causes of injury declined for construction. Next is manufacturing, and not much of a change here. You could see in the latest year, frequency did continue to decline. Now, labor market dynamics can impact claim frequency. And for manufacturing, employment growth was flat and even shrunk in the latest few years. So in other words, there was less employee turnover or less churn in the labor market, which could have led to the decline in frequency that we see. Now, as we're all very aware and watching closely, there's been recent economic policy changes to bring manufacturing back to the US. But we'll have to see how that plays out with employment over the next several years, and of course, how it impacts workplace injuries. Now, transportation and warehousing. The frequency increase starting in 2021 was largely driven by growth in the industry, specifically for couriers and messengers due to the rising demand for package deliveries as online shopping surged with the pandemic. Last year, frequency was flat, and we asked, is this the new normal, or will frequency trends return to the pre-pandemic decline? Well, frequency did come down about 2%, and in 2023, there was less turnover in the labor market. But since 1 year does not make a trend, I'm going to say the answer, for a moment, I'm going to actually take off my actuarial hat and I'm going to put on my economist hat, and I'm going to say the answer is a definite maybe. Motor vehicle accidents make up nearly 10% of transportation and warehousing claims, and you're going to hear more about them tomorrow as Brian Stein takes us for a ride through the latest motor vehicle accident trends. Our final update is for retail and wholesale trade. Now, both industries have a relatively flat frequency, declining just a bit less than 1% per year on average. However, both have seen frequency decline materially in 22 and 2023, with retail being the steepest. Okay, so with last year's industries covered, we're now jumping straight into new territory, starting with combined office. We saw that combined office has the largest share of payroll, but on a premium basis, is slightly smaller than construction and manufacturing. Before we get too far into the numbers, I want to take a quick detour because I want to talk about what's included in combined office, because this one is a little bit quirky. These 6 NAICS sectors that you see here make up combined office. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics takes them and lumps them into 3 supersectors: information, financial activities, and professional and business services. We group these 3 supersectors into the combined office industry. Now, most categories here are what you'd expect, right? It's people like most of us in this room. We sit at a desk, we use a computer, we attend Zoom meetings, maybe for some of us, like me, a bit too many. But one sector doesn't really fit. Administrative and support and waste management and remediation services is categorized by BLS as professional and business services, which is why we lumped it into the combined office definition. But notice that name doesn't exactly sound like all clerical work. So here's the payroll distribution for each sector, and then here's the premium. And notice that for administrative and support and waste management and remediation services, it's 22% of payroll, but more than 50% of premium. And that makes sense, which you'll see in a moment, because a good portion of this work is actually not clerical in nature and involves more risk. And you could see that right here by looking at the top classes in the sector. It includes jobs like janitorial services at an elevation. Think window washer harnessed to a building. and tree maintenance and garbage collection. Now, these jobs got lumped into the sector because it includes support services that keep offices running, like office security guards. But they're certainly not all desk jobs. So, with this quirkiness in mind, when we show frequency results, we're going to show them with and without this sector. And let's look at that. So here you could see frequency change for all of combined office. Notice the trend was somewhat similar to the all industry average, but the latest year frequency change was considerably lower. Now, in technology and banking, there were some layoffs and a slowdown in hiring that started in 2023, which may be at least partially have contributed to this recent frequency reduction. Now, as I mentioned, we split out the administrative and support and waste management and remediation services. Notice that the trends are pretty close. But starting in 2020, the truly office work sectors declined more significantly and remained at that lower level. So this begs the question, what changed for workers, especially office workers, starting in 2020? Any guesses? Remote work, yes. There are some questions we've been thinking about in this post-pandemic environment, like how is the higher level of remote work impacting claim frequency? And can we see different trends in classes that are more or less impacted by remote work? To answer this question, we need to know how much the amount of remote work has changed over time. So we're starting here with a data point that gives us a pre-pandemic estimate of just over 7% of days work remotely. With the pandemic, that number jumped to about 60% before declining to about 30% or so by the middle of 2021. And since then, there hasn't been much movement. So you could see that line is basically flat. I do want to point out, though, these statistics are based on the whole economy, not just the combined office sector. If it were just office work that we were looking at here, these percentages would for sure be a lot higher. Now, to determine the impact of work from home, we can't only rely on the combined office industry. There's two reasons for that. One, not all jobs within the combined office industry can be work from home. So think of a real estate agent that needs to work with clients. And then the other way is true too. So there could be office work in other industries, like clerical workers that can work from home who work at a construction company. So we solve for this by pinpointing a handful of large classes with the highest concentration of remote workers. These remote-friendly classes include clerical office workers, insurance company workers, bankers, and other similar type classes. Here you can see the sizable payroll share for the remote-friendly classes in combined office, which equates to a smaller share of premium because of the low-risk nature of remote-friendly work. So the takeaway here is that we've identified several remote-friendly classes which account for about 14% of combined office industry premium. Now, let's compare the combined office claim frequency for remote-friendly classes and for the other classes. Notice that beginning in 2020, trends diverge. All other classes in the office sector had a small dip in 2020, an immediate recovery in 2021, and since then, frequency has been declining. For remote-friendly classes in this sector, notice that there was a big drop in 2020, and then frequency kind of remained at that lower level. You don't see that rebound, and it is starting to slope up a bit as maybe some workers have started shifting back to in-person work. Since 2019, frequency declined 32% for remote-friendly classes and 15% for all other classes in combined office, pointing us to the conclusion that frequency declined when workers worked remotely. But let's keep going with this. Remote-friendly classes, as we mentioned before, can be in any industry. So we added here the bar for other industries to both charts. And again, we could see the sizable payroll is on the left, which equates to less premium on the right. And now let's compare frequency patterns. The dotted lines represent remote-friendly classes for other industries, and the solid line is the same one we saw a moment ago, corresponding to remote-friendly classes in the combined office. We see for these classes in other industries that frequency declined to a much lesser degree in 2020. And since then, it's mostly recovered, and it's only 6% below the 2019 level. So what is going on here, right? Both of these lines represent remote-friendly classes. They're just in different industries. Well, here's our hypothesis. The amount of remote work in remote-friendly classes differs between combined office and other industries because it is easier to work remote when your coworkers are also working remotely. So for example, if you work for, say, an insurance company, you probably can work remotely, and there's a really good chance that your clerical support staff can also work remotely. On the other hand, workers in other industries, like factory workers, they have no choice. They have to go in and work in person. And then there's a really good chance that their clerical support staff may also feel compelled to go in and work in person. All of this research leads us to the finding that working remotely lowers frequency significantly. Next, we're going to look at leisure and hospitality, which is made up of two NAICS sectors: art, entertainment, and recreation, and accommodation and food services. Leisure and hospitality makes up about 6% of NCCI premium. And there are two key insights for leisure and hospitality frequency. First, claim frequency has declined at a slower pace than the all-industry average, which you could see on this graph. And second, it was impacted to a greater degree by the pandemic. Leisure and hospitality frequency dipped more than the all-industry average and then jumped back to pre-pandemic levels in 2021. Now, the larger drop in 2020 is actually not surprising, given the impact that the pandemic had on employment. Employment dropped 25% in 2020 due to layoffs, and then only very recently recovered back to pre-pandemic levels. Since 2021, leisure and hospitality frequency has declined, averaging about -3% annually. Wages are also linked to the frequency story. As the world reopened in 2021 and 2022, leisure and hospitality wages skyrocketed. They went up 18% in just 2 years. Now, a sharp rise like that in wages could signal increased pressure for hiring managers, potentially incentivizing them to hire less qualified workers, or assign double shifts, or have them take on multiple roles. As you can imagine, practices like these can contribute to worsening claim frequency, which is exactly what we saw in 2021. Do you remember the stories of McDonald's locations offering incentives like tuition reimbursement and $50 just to show up for an interview and free iPhones for employees? It was not easy to attract workers in the middle of a pandemic. Looking at the makeup of leisure and hospitality, you could see that food services and drinking plates, which for simplicity, I'm just going to call them restaurants, makes up the lion's share of the industry. And as it turns out, frequency trend in restaurants is different from the other leisure and hospitality subsectors, at least in the latest couple of years. And let's look at that. You could see that other leisure and hospitality subsectors, which include things like concerts and sporting events and travel, were more heavily impacted by the pandemic. Restaurants were able to transition to outside seating and food delivery and takeout, whereas these other businesses that have large crowds that gather had to more completely shut down. So notice that restaurants is driving that recent decrease that we saw for all of leisure and hospitality frequency. But let's drill down further Here we're going to look at frequency by cause of injury, and we're looking at a bubble chart. The size of these bubbles represents claim share. So just think bigger bubbles, more claims. And then the height of the bubbles, or the y-axis, measures the average annual change in frequency, and on this graph we're looking at 2021 through 2023. And notice that frequency for almost all causes of injury is declining, and you could see that because the bubbles are sitting below the x-axis, or below 0. There are two types of injuries with the largest share of claims, and that's slips and falls and strains. And that holds true for restaurants and all other industries combined. But there are two causes of injury that are more common in restaurants, so burn and cut claims. And that's not unexpected given the nature of food preparation and cooking. The positive side of this is that these injuries typically incur lower costs. Think of a minor stovetop burn or a cut from chopping vegetables. It's going to look quite different than cuts or burns if there was, let's say, a manufacturing accident. As a matter of fact, restaurant cut injuries cost 50% less and burns 75% less than the same type of claim in other industries. Now, automation in restaurants can help reduce workplace accidents. Think of the last meal that you had at a full-service restaurant. Maybe it was this past week during Mother's Day, and happy Mother's Day to all the moms that are out there, a little belated. Chances are that the server used a mobile card reader to process the payment right at your table. No need to walk back and forth to a cash register. Not only does this speed things up, but it reduces foot traffic and the number of staff walking about, lowering the chance of mishaps. Now, I think we're all familiar with food ordering kiosks at fast food restaurants, but even upscale restaurants are adopting automation. This second photo I took with my family at an Asian restaurant in Chicago, and you all may have seen these before, but we were so surprised to see a robot delivering our food and the check. And then the third image is of a pink self-driving food delivery robot that I saw all over the Brickell neighborhood in Miami while I was visiting my son. So, you know, it's really interesting to see how advances in automation and technology continue to shape the future of work comp claims. Okay, we are going to shift gears once again, and we're going to drill into the healthcare industry. Healthcare makes up about 10% of NCCI payroll, but 16% of private industry payroll. And that's because many large hospitals will self-insure and do not report that data to NCCI. On a premium basis, it makes up 7% of NCCI premium. Now, healthcare employment typically doesn't decline in a recession. It's sort of considered to exist outside of the economic cycle. But the pandemic was different. During the pandemic, if you remember back, there were some areas of employment for healthcare where there was fewer elective procedures or less routine type healthcare visits. Then there were other areas of employment that surged with the demand for urgent care as COVID cases grew. Overall, healthcare employment declined by less than the all-industry average, as you can see. But in the last 3 years, employment has been growing by more than 4%, so way outpacing the all-industry average. And there's two key reasons for this. One is an aging population, which I'm personally not participating in, so thank you. An aging population may be driving the greater demand for healthcare services. And then secondly is a hiring rebound. So hiring was lagging in 2021, and now the industry is just kind of playing catch up. While employment grew significantly in healthcare in 2023 and 2024, wages grew by less than the all-industry average. Now, in those years, pandemic incentive bonuses started phasing out, putting downward pressure on wages. In fact, wages in the healthcare industry have grown at a slower rate than the all-industry average in all years except for 2022, when it was significantly higher, and then in 2016, when it was only minimally higher. What's really interesting, though, is notice that even with all that churn in the labor market that we've been talking about, we are not seeing an adverse impact on claim frequency. As a matter of fact, there is a clear downward trend declining by more than 20% since 2015. The biggest contributor to this decline is a decrease in strain injuries, which account for over a third of healthcare claims. Think about caregivers. How many of you remember an elderly parent or grandparent being helped by a caregiver? Years ago, when my grandmother had a caregiver, we had a woman that worked for her, and she was amazing. She did everything, the bathing and feeding and cooking and cleaning and moving her from the bed to the chair to the couch. More recently, when my mom needed help and moved in with us, we were told that we needed to hire 2 caregivers, at least for part of the day, not just one, because best practices required 2 caregivers or use of a mechanical lift for patient transfers. So while safety improvements like these have contributed to the long-term decline in claim frequency, we also want to recognize that practical challenges such as staffing shortages can make it difficult to consistently follow safety protocols. But the data does reflect improvement. Healthcare strains decreased nearly 30% in the past 8 years. And one more thing that I want to mention. This graph, like all the others in this presentation, exclude COVID claims. And that is intentional, because when we're analyzing historical trends to predict future results, typically we want to exclude the extraordinary disruptions that are unlikely to recur again. But even with that, let's just look at it anyway. This frequency chart here includes COVID claims. So in most industries and in aggregate, if we include COVID claims, it almost doesn't really matter because the frequency trends really don't significantly change by COVID. But healthcare is different. You'll notice here it caused a massive spike in frequency in 2020. And the only good news here is that many COVID claims were small indemnity-only type injuries, so the average cost of a claim declined considerably. Now, as we move further away from 2020, the impact of COVID diminishes. In 2023, the impact of COVID on total losses accounted for less than 0.5%. Okay, our final industry is education, which is comprised of the NAICS educational services sector. And since public education is mostly self-insured, what we're actually talking about here is private education. And for context, this includes private K-12 schools, private 2- and 4-year colleges, assuming they don't self-insure, computer schools, language schools, cooking schools, and other similar type of organizations. Education represents the smallest sector, making up about 2% of NCCI premium. Private education frequency trend is very different from the other industries. It has not been declining, and aside from that big pandemic plunge that you see, it has actually increased. Now, pandemic-related disruptions contributed to that 2020 frequency decline, which was over 30%, a much larger decline than any other industry. And while frequency is still lower than the pre-pandemic level, it's been increasing in 2022 and 2023, and that is a trend that we don't see in any other industry. So what's causing the increase? Well, we looked at this by cause of injury, and the top 3 causes of injury in private education, which make up 85% of claims, are slips and falls, strains, and struck or injured by. That glaring, sharp increase in the struck or injured by category, that is what's driving the increase in overall education frequency. And notice that prior to the pandemic, it was increasing then too. In 2023, 1 in 5 claims for education was a struck or injured by claim. So at this point, you may be on the edge of your seat wondering what exactly are these educators being struck or hit by? And so we drilled down and found that the what is actually a who. These injuries include kicking, stabbing, and biting. And so what the data is pointing to is a significant increase in workplace violence in private education. Now, NCCI is currently exploring some research related to workplace violence, so keep an eye out for more on this topic. Let's take a look at employment changes. So similar to healthcare, employment also is typically recession-proof. But once again, the pandemic was different, and this industry was hit the hardest. Unsurprisingly, employment plummeted in 2020 due to layoffs that affected both teachers and educational support staff. And then there was a strong rebound in 2021. Since then, employment has been up and down for the industry. Wage growth for private education has been comparatively weak, falling at or below the all-industry average in every year since 2017. And while private education wage growth in 2020 exceeded 8%, it fell flat the following year, growing just over 2%. Since 2021, wage growth has crept up, but remains below the all-industry average. Okay, so exciting news. You are the first to hear about NCCI's upcoming industry trend report. It is a new resource that builds on today's insights. And in addition to frequency, it's also going to have severity trends for both medical and indemnity losses. And all of this is going to be by industry. We're going to provide more details around the insights and methodologies than what I was able to get to today. There's going to be graphs. You'll be able to download the underlying values. It launches next month on ncci.com, so watch out for it. As we wrap up, let's revisit some of the key insights we covered. We drilled into industry-specific trends and unpacked key drivers behind the changes. Frequency continues its steady decline, but it's different by industry and important to understand the dynamics. In combined office, claim frequency for remote workers declined significantly in 2020 and remained low for those who continue to work remotely. In leisure and hospitality, claim frequency for restaurants declined in 2022 and 23, while for other subsectors, it remained flat. Despite the pandemic disruption, healthcare claim frequency generally declined, driven by a reduction in strain injuries. The rise in claim frequency in private education is driven by an increase in struck or injured by incidents, which may be linked to workplace violence. Workers and workplaces are safer today than ever, and it's vital for us to continue monitoring frequency trends by industry. I'm available during the breaks at our Meet the Expert area and at tonight's dinner. I welcome the opportunity to connect with you. Thank you so much.